Antonio Meucci invented the telephone in 1860, 16 years before Bell. He couldn't afford to renew the caveat, the annual fee. Didn't have it. In 2002, the U.S. Congress officially recognized his priority. 120 years after that could have meant anything at all. Behind every first in history, there's a line of people hammering on the same door from the other side. The only question is who ran to the patent office fastest, who had the right connections, who knew how to work a room, and who just couldn't scrape together $10 when it mattered. Two people discovered evolution simultaneously. Calculus, also two, who then spent the better part of 2 decades publicly destroying each other's reputations. Oxygen was isolated in 1772, but the world didn't hear about it until 1774, because the man who found it didn't know how to push a publisher. The one who grabbed the pen goes in the textbook. The rest go in brackets, or footnotes, or get a resolution from Congress a century too late. You're watching Academic Troll, the right place for people who want to understand the world and not die of boredom doing it. Like, subscribe, let's go.
Chapter 1. The Guy Who Got Scooped from a Jungle. 1858. While Darwin spent 20 years in his country estate collecting evidence, Wallace was hacking through malarial jungles in Southeast Asia, catching beetles, barely keeping himself alive. In February 1858, on the island of Ternate, another fever hits, and somewhere between the chills and the sweating, the idea arrives. If resources are scarce, the ones with an advantage survive, the weak die, the strong reproduce, species change. He gets up, writes it out in 3 days, posts it to Darwin, someone he trusted. That trust was somewhat premature. Darwin reads it and realizes the malarial jungle just produced in a weekend the conclusion he'd been working toward for 20 years. His friends arrange a joint presentation of both papers to the Linnean Society. Nobody asked Wallace. He was still on his island, unaware. Darwin spent the next year finishing On the Origin of Species. The print run sold out in a single day, and he became the symbol of evolutionary theory for good. Wallace got a mention in parentheses, and Wallace, the academic equivalent of being tagged in someone else's photo. He never complained, called Darwin the greatest scientist of the age. Either a saint, or someone who accepted what most people never managed to. History isn't about fairness. It's about narrative. And narrative belongs to whoever has a publisher.
Chapter 2. The Man Who Judged His Own Case. Newton invented calculus in 1666, during a plague lockdown, at home, with an apple orchard and a clear schedule. Brilliant idea, brilliant result, and the manuscript went straight into a drawer for 20 years. Why publish when you already know you're right? The intellectual equivalent of writing a hit song and leaving it in a shoebox under your bed. Leibniz arrives at the same thing independently in 1675, by a different route, with different notation, and unlike Newton, publishes immediately, in a form other people can actually use. That elongated S you wrote in notebooks for integrals and hated? That's Leibniz. By the time Newton finally went public, European mathematics was already running on Leibniz's system. What followed was one of the most toxic priority disputes in scientific history. The Royal Society launched an investigation and ruled in Newton's favor, with Newton himself chairing the committee. He literally judged his own case. Not a metaphor. Documented fact. Leibniz died in disgrace. One secretary at his funeral. Newton outlived him by 11 years. A knight, president of the Royal Society, a national hero. Power doesn't just write history. Sometimes it chairs the committee that decides who gets credit for it.
Chapter 3. A Matter of Hours. February 14th, 1876. On the same day, 2 patent applications land at the U.S. Patent Office for the same device, a machine for transmitting the human voice over wires. Bell filed in the morning, Gray in the afternoon. A few hours, and the official history of the telephone begins with one man having set his alarm earlier than another. Gray was the more accomplished inventor. Dozens of telegraph patents, serious reputation, well-equipped lab. Bell was a young Scottish teacher of the deaf with no real engineering background, but with investors demanding returns and a patent attorney who knew how the system worked. What followed were years of litigation. Gray pointed to technical details in his application that Bell's lacked, to chronological inconsistencies, to suspicious edits made after documents had already been filed.
Historians are still arguing about whether Bell's victory was entirely clean. Bell won all the key cases, over 600, and became one of the wealthiest men in America. Gray founded Western Electric and died as the man history remembers as the one who almost. As for Meucci, already covered. Couldn't afford the renewal fee, greetings from 2002. Bell in the textbooks, Gray in the footnote, Meucci in the footnote's footnote. February 14th, 1876. Valentine's Day. History's most expensive love triangle.
Chapter 4. The Man Who Got There First and Lost Anyway. January 1839. The French Academy of Sciences announces that Louis Daguerre, painter, theatrical scenery designer, has invented a method of fixing images onto silver-coated plates. Paris erupts. Newspapers declare painting dead. Artists panic. Opticians can't restock fast enough. The French government buys the patent and declares the invention a gift to the world, free for everyone, except the British, who still had to pay. 2 weeks before the announcement, William Fox Talbot reads the newspaper previews about Daguerre in a quiet English laboratory, and his legs go weak. He's been doing exactly the same thing for 5 years. He rushes his work to the Royal Society, the guest who arrives just as the host is already putting on his coat. They had invented different things. The daguerreotype, a single, unrepeatable image, beautiful and utterly uncopyable. Talbot invented the negative, one original, unlimited copies. Everything photography became, family albums, newspapers, cinema, every photo ever shared. That's Talbot's architecture, with Daguerre's name above the door. Daguerre's name became a word. Talbot's settled into academic articles next to calotype, which nobody remembers. The history of photography could have been called Talbotypy, more accurate, but accuracy has always lost to whoever got into the papers first. Chapter 5. 18 Centuries Too Early. Aristarchus of Samos figured out that the Earth orbits the Sun around 270 BC, 18 centuries before Copernicus, 19 before Galileo, 20 before the church started burning people for saying exactly that. The Stoic Cleanthes proposed bringing Aristarchus to trial for impiety, for dislodging the Earth the gods had clearly intended to stand still. Most philosophers shrugged and went back to Aristotle, theologically convenient, requiring no rewriting of anyone's textbooks. Almost none of Aristarchus's work survived. We know about his heliocentrism only because Archimedes mentioned it in passing, a footnote inside another footnote. The man who got the solar system right spent 2,000 years as a footnote to people who got it wrong. Copernicus arrives at the same model in the 1510s through the mathematics of Ptolemy, which by then had accumulated so many corrective epicycles it had become an architectural disaster. He publishes in 1543, the year of his death. The first copy reached him on his deathbed. He held it and never let go. The difference between Aristarchus and Copernicus wasn't the idea. It was the 18 centuries between them. One arrived when the world could still afford to ignore the answer, the other when it couldn't.
Chapter 6. The same answer 3 times. Somewhere in Mesopotamia, around 3200 BC, a temple administrator sits down with a reed and a wet clay tablet. Not to write poetry, not to record history. He's writing down that a man named Cusham received a shipment of barley and owes back 37 units. Cusham is the first named human being in recorded history. Not a king, not a god, not a hero. An accountant's debtor. The first thing humanity needed writing for was a receipt. Writing was invented 3 times, independently, on separate continents, without the faintest contact. Around 1200 BC, Chinese priests began recording questions to the gods on turtle shells, thousands of miles from the Middle East. No contact, same solution. The Maya developed their own system by the 3rd century BC, phonetic, complex enough to record astronomy and history. After the conquest, Spanish missionaries burned almost everything, calling it the devil's work. Out of thousands of codices, 4 survived. 3 civilizations, 3 systems. 0 coordination. The problem gets complicated enough, the stakes get high enough, and the answer appears whether or not anyone gifted is nearby. Writing wasn't invented, it was arrived at. Given enough people, enough grain, and enough neighbors you don't trust, it was going to happen.
Chapter 7. The Man Who Fixed the Machine.
1763. James Watt did not invent steam. This needs saying. The school myth about Watt and a kettle is a piece of folk fiction that's been doing damage to historical understanding for 2 centuries. It's the kind of story that sounds so satisfying that nobody wants to check whether it's true. Usually a bad sign. Before Watt, steam was already doing work. Just badly. Papin built a piston cylinder in 1690. Savory was selling steam pumps to miners in 1698. Newcomen in 1712 built an engine that genuinely pumped water out of mines. By the 1730s, dozens were running across Britain, belching coal smoke and consuming fuel at a rate that would make a modern accountant weep. Watt arrived in 1763 not from scratch. Someone handed him a broken Newcomen engine and asked him to fix it. He fixed it, and saw that the machine was wasting most of its energy because every cycle cooled the entire cylinder. He designed a separate condenser, one component that changed efficiency so dramatically that the entire Industrial Revolution became technically possible. Not an invention of steam, a surgical improvement of a machine that already existed. The distinction is real. It never made it into any curriculum. Papin, Savory, Newcomen. The revolution ran on their walk. History put one name on the door, moved on, and started selling commemorative biscuit tins.
Chapter 8. 3 Sentences. Carl Wilhelm Scheele was a Swedish apothecary in provincial Köping, a town you've never heard of and won't hear of for any other reason. Improvised equipment, publication pace best described as non-existent. And yet, Scheele discovered chlorine, manganese, barium, molybdenum, tungsten, and roughly a dozen other substances, output that would make most modern research departments quietly reconsider their grant applications. He isolated oxygen in 1772, described it, wrote the book, which came out in 1777 because the publisher wasn't rushing and Scheele had no idea how to make him. Priestley isolated oxygen independently in 1774 and published it once. The world decided the discovery belonged to whoever spoke first. Scheele had 2 years on him. Didn't matter. The ending is strange. Neither of them understood what they'd actually found. Both interpreted their results through the wrong framework. Lavoisier, who never isolated oxygen at all, heard about the experiment, reproduced it, and built the entire foundation of modern chemistry on top of it. Scheele isolated it. Priestley published it. Lavoisier understood it. 3 roles, 1 discovery. The credit went to the last man in, the one who made sense of what the others had already done. In science, understanding sometimes outranks finding.
Chapter 9. The Right Idea at the Wrong Time. In 1840, a German physician named Meyer is sailing toward Indonesia and notices that the venous blood of sailors in the tropics is noticeably brighter than in cold climates. The body burns less fuel. Ambient heat covers part of the work. He arrives at what we now call the law of conservation of energy, writes it up, the journal rejects it. No physics credentials, wrong journal, unknown name. He publishes elsewhere in 1842 and receives silence, the kind you'd recognize from sending a carefully written email and watching the read receipt appear, and nothing else. Around the same time, English brewer and amateur physicist Joule measures the warming of water from spinning paddles, calculating the exact ratio of work to heat. Where Mayer reasoned in principles, Joule counted with the precision of someone accountable for every degree in a fermentation vat. The right circles take notice. Mayer's name is not among them. Mayer watches his idea get rediscovered under other names, loses 2 children, has a breakdown, and is committed to a psychiatric institution by his own brother. He got out. He lived to see recognition. But he spent 20 years in between as a man the world had quietly filed under wrong. The right idea at the wrong moment isn't a lesser victory. It's not a victory at all.
Chapter 10. Too Many Fathers. In 1945, Vannevar Bush describes an archive where documents connect through associative links. The reader leaps between them following a thread of thought. Bush built nothing, but the description was so precise it's still cited as prophecy 40 years later. Engelbart reads that essay and holds on to it for 20 years. In 1968, he walks onto a stage in San Francisco and demonstrates a computer with a mouse, hypertext, and video conferencing. The audience sits open-mouthed. It's 1968, and the man on stage is showing them 1998. The demo becomes legendary. The funding dries up anyway. Nelson independently coins the word hypertext in 1963 and develops Xanadu, a global system of linked documents.
still unfinished after 60 years. Berners-Lee in 1989 sends a proposal to his boss at CERN and gets back, vague but exciting. He creates HTTP, HTML, and the first web server, patents nothing, gives it away. In commercial terms, a catastrophic decision. In historical terms, one of the largest gifts one person has handed to everyone else. Who invented the internet? Bush described it, Engelbart demonstrated it, Nelson named it, Berners-Lee built it. None of them in contact with the others. And uniquely, none of them sued. For a story about invention, that's the most remarkable detail of all.
What we are left with: 10 stories, one name in the textbook each time. That part is already clear. What's harder to sit with is the mechanism underneath. Not bad luck, not conspiracy, something more structural. We need the history of ideas to have a protagonist. One face, one moment, one flash of insight in a candlelit room. The lone genius is a compression algorithm for the past. It loses most of the data, but it fits on a monument, in a biography, in the 2 minutes a teacher has before the bell. The actual pattern is less romantic and more consistent. The question gets loud enough, the moment arrives, and the answer appears. In a country estate and a malarial jungle, in a London lab and a Parisian studio, in a Swiss physics facility and a Silicon Valley garage. Simultaneously, independently, because the problem was ready, not because the person was exceptional. We remember one, not because the others didn't matter, because memory has limits, and monuments only have room for a single name.